Hi, I'm George Runkle. My company is Runkle Consulting. We're structural engineers. And today what I'm going to talk about is codes and standards as far as building. Now, way back when, at some time in the past, they built buildings without codes. You just put them up, whatever you wanted. If it stood, fine. If it fell down, oh well. Way back in the day of Hammurabi, though, there apparently was some problems, and in his laws, he passed a number of things which we could call our first building codes. If I built a house and it fell down and you died, I would get executed, which was a pretty good way of having a punishment for not following the codes. Today, codes are a little bit more in depth. The earliest codes in the United States were done by major cities. They'd have their own criteria for building buildings. It was to put some sort of control over how buildings went up. For example, New York City came up with codes requiring windows to living spaces because they're building tenements where you had living spaces with no air coming in, no windows. Um, Fire escapes came into codes because people would die when buildings would catch on fire. Theaters, they had egress requirements, so an entire theater of people wouldn't die if there was a fire. And over time, it evolved forward to where we have had, towards the end of the 20th century, regional codes. You had the Uniform Building Code, you had the Southern Building Code, and the Boca Code, which, depending on where you lived, might be the code that was adopted, by your state. Also, some states had their own codes. This created a lot of unnecessary confusion. So what happened was all of the different regional codes combined to form the International Code Council. Now, here's an example. This is the 2012 International Building Code. Uh, This applies in Georgia right now. Most of the states have gone over to the International Building Code. There is some exceptions. Florida, North Carolina, California are examples I can think of. Washington, D.C. also has its own code. All of these codes are the same format as the International Series of Building Codes, though, to make it easier to work through. And pretty much they say the same thing as the International Building Code. Um, in addition to the standard general code, the International Building Code, there's specialized codes that also come out. There's a plumbing code, there's a mechanical code, an energy conservation code, a fire code, and a residential code. The residential code is basically what they call prescriptive code. It tells you what size foundations you have to put in, what size floor joists you have to use, what size uh, wall studs. All of that is covered in tables so that a builder can build a house without having to go to an architect or engineer to do all that detailing work. Um, Now, how are codes adopted? Uh, they're adopted on a cycle. The cycle is about 6 years. So right now, the 2012 code is going on in Georgia. There's a minor set of updates that have come out with 2015 codes. Those are not adopted by Georgia. They are by some other states. And then you have the 2018 code, which will be coming out next year sometime, and that will be in turn adopted by Georgia. Now, in the code, we have different chapters here. For example, we have the structural design chapter, which is what I'm concerned with, which gives you a basic criteria for structural design. You have soils and foundations, you have steel. Steel is not really very detailed. It basically, what it will do is refer you back to a design standard. The current one here that's valid is this one, Steel Construction Manual, and deep in here is the specification for design, which is what we use to design with in accordance with the building code. Let's see if I can get to the first page of this without eating up too much time. And here we go, all the different stuff in here. And here it is. The specification for structural steel buildings. It's right here, AISC 360-10. That is the standard that's referred to by the code, the 2012 code. Now there's other standards by the code refers to too, that have to do with different areas of design. You have standards to do with wood design. You have standards to do with concrete design. Architects have things they specify that also have to be following standards that are mentioned in the code. And the reason for this is obviously if I had to put all this stuff into here, we'd end up with volumes and volumes of codes. And each of these standards are produced by the different organizations that are involved, that are specialized. Like this is the American Institute of Steel Construction. I don't have it nearby here. Oh, here's one. Here's one for using wood. This is produced by the American Wood Council. Right here, it's specialized publication, and it's referenced in the code if we're doing wood design. And it's a much more efficient method of doing things. Now, one of the mistakes that I've seen done repeatedly is with home inspectors. I deal with that a lot because I do a lot of wood design. A home inspector will go into a house and maybe it's just been constructed and he'll refer to like the 2015 code. That doesn't apply here in Georgia. The 2012 code does. And you have to understand, it's the code that the state adopted. There are some states out there that are using a 2009 version of the International Code. Some states are still using 2006. Why? I don't know. So you have to use that version of the code. The other thing is if you have an existing structure, it doesn't have to comply with the current code. Otherwise, it'd be a nightmare. Every time the code came out with an updated code, you'd have to go back and backfit all these buildings. It would cost a fortune. The building that you have, the existing building, only has to be brought up to code compliance if you're modifying the building. And of course, how much the modification has got to be is open for interpretation, and it's something that's hard to determine a lot of times. I've got one right now where we've got a house with a deck on the back and we're enclosing the deck. I interpret that to mean I've got to bring that deck up to current code standards because we're modifying it. Another engineer might say no, because we're not touching the deck itself, we're just putting a roof over it and enclosing it. I don't agree with that. And I'm going to kind of go towards the most secure interpretation, especially when it's something like a deck, which could fall off a house and kill people. I don't want to take any chances. Now, another thing about codes. Anything that's specifically called out in the code is mandatory. You can't say, oh, I don't need to design this building for 110, 115 mile per hour wind load. It'll never get that. I'll give you an example. Had a house I was designing. Had wide open floor spaces, very narrow house, open windows, and I had a hell of a time designing it so it would stand up to the wind loads that were in the code. And at the time we had a 90 mile per hour wind load requirement under the code here in Georgia. And I designed it by that, and it required a heck of a frame to hold that thing still. The architect argued with me, says, why are you doing this? And I said, I have to design it for a 90 mile per hour wind load. And he says, well, what's the odds of that happening? You're not going to get a 90 mile per hour wind here in Atlanta? Come on, what's the odds? And I said, it doesn't matter. The code says 90 miles per hour, it's 90 miles per hour. Well, as it turned out, where the thing was located was in the old 4th Ward, which was hit within that year by a tornado, 90 miles per hour. The chances of being hit by a 90 mile per hour wind load were 100%. And there was no damage to the building at all. It had a stucco finish, not a crack. It worked. So it's not open for interpretation. I wish they had explained the codes when I was an undergraduate, when I was in school, because we didn't understand that. Now the other thing is going to happen. This is what's important about understanding the codes. When you're designing for a certain code, like let's say again, we're in 2012 here in Georgia, we're putting up a building. I ran into this early in my career, worked for a large company. They wanted me to do a design. I needed steel design standards. They give me an old book. Hell, this is fairly new. The one they gave me was back in 1962. It shows how old I am or how old they are. I don't know. You can't do that. If you're going to design something today, here, you can't use this old steel standard. I've got this because I paid a lot of money for it and I can't bring myself to throw it away. I guess that's all. You got to use the current standard, the current code. You can't design the archaic stuff. Most of the time there's little changes in what the standards require, but sometimes there are. In the steel design, there's some big changes in how things have happened. Wood design, there's some big changes that have happened with the strengths of the wood. The other stuff, pretty much the same. Not much has changed. Okay, I hope I've clarified it. If you like this video, please press like in the lower right corner. And please subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more of these type of videos. Thank you very much.